The other day I just finished making a video that began cataloguing video games that had similar worlds to Blade Runner. During that video I explained how this was due to my love/borderline obsession with the entire franchise. And a few months before this, I made another video which went over the history of every Blade Runner game ever released. And in doing research for this video, there was one game in particular. A game that will be the subject of this video. A game that upon researching it, I was honestly pretty shocked by. It was a game that I had never heard of, a game that no one else seemed to have ever heard of, and a game that is no longer available to buy. So let me try and set the scene for you. To go over the history of Blade Runner games again very briefly, we have Blade Runner, a side-scrolling shooting game released in 1985, Blade Runner, a point-and-click game released in 1997, Replicant Pursuit, a VR game where you fly around chasing replicants, released in 2017. Memory Lab, a VR game where you play as a Blade Runner solving crimes, released also in 2017. Rogue, a tactical turn-based mobile game released in 2021, which brings us to our game. In the years following the release of Blade Runner 2049 in 2017, a trio of games were announced relating to the franchise. All three of these games would be virtual reality: Replicant Pursuit, Memory Lab, and Blade Runner Revelations. Released in 2018, developed by a company called Seismic Games, this was to be an exclusive game to a platform called the Google Daydream, which was the successor to the bare-bones Google Cardboard, and seemingly the first solid step that Google would take into the VR arena. The game was set between the first and second movie, and poetically based in the year 2023. As to be expected, you play as a Blade Runner hunting down replicants, and before we get into the actual game, I would like to talk about some of the build-up that went into the game and the sad fate it seemed to meet. And I would also like to possibly play this game myself, and I suppose you'll see if I'm successful in doing that at the end of this video. So let's delve in. The game was announced in January of 2018. In July of that same year, there was actually a panel for Blade Runner Revelations at San Diego Comic-Con, which saw the Seismic Games CCO, the narrative director, and the two main actors who voiced characters in the game. The panel lasted 1 hour, and they spoke about how the game weaves and fits into the rest of the Blade Runner lore, and it's clear from watching this that they are all genuinely fans of the franchise. And hearing all of them talk about what went into the game, in terms of the thought process, the story they wanted to tell, the motivations of the characters, and even writing their own city speak, it's just such a shame that this is only seen by the people attending that panel, or the literal 226 views that the video has on YouTube with 0 comments. When you realise that the culmination of all of this created effort resulted in such a little known game, it just feels as though all of this thought and work was wasted. Upon looking for info on the build-up to this game, I managed to find a few trailers, some great concept art, and even an interview with the sound designers for the game. They talked through how they want the game to sound and if they want it to fit more of the first film or the second film. And then there's the composers. Yes, this game has an original score, specifically made for the game itself, which definitely echoes Vangelis. And much like the game, the soundtrack seems to have gone incredibly under the radar. So now it's time to get to the actual game. I am aware of at least one full playthrough of this game on YouTube, and I have briefly skipped through parts of it, and I could just watch the whole thing, but I really wanted to go above and beyond and see if I could get this game working and experience it in the way it was intended. This would of course be a challenge, as the Google Daydream was discontinued in 2019, and Blade Runner Revelations along with it. This included anybody who actually bought the game, who simply lost the ability to play it forever, which is incidentally another reason why this is just such a bad fate for this project. So I set out to find a working version of this game too. I speculatively asked ChatGPT if this was even possible, and it reassured me that it was, and along with some additional research I decided that it would possibly be possible. I managed to find a second-hand Google Daydream quite easily for about £20. I then found an old version of the Daydream app and tried it on an old Samsung device I had, only for it to tell me that my device was out of date and not compatible, and after doing more research, I found that it was compatible with the Samsung S8. I had the S7, but it would have been quite mad for me to buy another phone just to play some abandoned Blade Runner VR gimmick, so I ended up leaving it. No, I'm clearly joking. I went and got a second-hand S8, so with hope in my heart and a hole in my wallet, I would experience this game. After some strange glitches and experiencing some creepy liminal abandoned VR spaces and getting the hang of how the controller worked, I finally managed to get into the game's menu, and I just allowed the experience to wash over me. To anybody who's a Blade Runner fan, this will send chills down your spine. The world all around you, the sights, the sounds, the music. I just had to take a minute to just stand here and take it all in. Unfortunately, the problems didn't end there. I tried to capture the screen to have this footage, and the format that it's captured in requires me to greatly reduce the quality of it. I tried to correct the lens distortion. It doesn't allow me to capture audio from the game unless I upgrade to Android version 10, which I can't do unless I install an emulator, and after one level it began to overheat. But apart from all of that, the game technically worked. The game even has its own opening crawl like the movie. I'm kind of torn on how much to show. I don't know if I'll regurgitate the entire story, and there definitely won't be footage of the whole thing, given the difficulties recording this. I will try and summarise the story, but mostly I think I'll be focusing on how the game feels as a Blade Runner fan going into it, but I will provide a link to a full playthrough of it. We start with a cool cutscene of you driving your spinner. At this point I was just focused on looking all around me, trying to look at all the different buildings, how detailed they were, how far out they went. And this kind of scenario, sitting in your car looking out the window, is ideal for VR. You end up landing in Chinatown, and this is where you begin playing as Blade Runner Harper. Here you're given a small area to kind of move around and explore, so obviously I just spent the entire time looking around, looking up in awe. Of course, the idea of looking down at a cityscape is iconic, which is why I find the idea of being at the ground level of that city looking up so interesting. To their credit, they've put in a lot of detail here. We have some Hare Krishnas dancing, there's a theatre just behind them with crowds of people walking past. There is also a dialogue system in this game, which to me seems like they've gone the extra mile. In this level you can ask people questions, interrogate them, all while being surrounded by the elements of the Blade Runner world. You can pick up a magazine which talks about labour shortages because of androids being retired. The level ends when you begin asking too many questions and a replicant attacks you. At this point, Gaff shows up, being the first but not the last character from the movies you'll see. Once this area is completed, you get another scene of you flying through the city, and once again I spent the entire time just looking out the window. Each time you have one of these scenes, your personal AI, Holly, will have a conversation with you, debrief you, talk to you about stuff. The next scene is the police station, which again is very faithful to the one from the movie, and walking around here as a Blade Runner obsessed fan is just very surreal. There's also something very interesting about our desk. There's a few things that you can do in this station, including eating candy and donuts. You can also talk to your colleagues and even ask them their opinion about replicants. Your colleagues do begin to mention how Holden is different now. You then go and have a meeting with him in his office, and he appears to have this kind of neck brace, presumably as a result from the attack from Leon, which continues on from a deleted scene from the first movie, which is just a great way to pull it all together, and he's ranting about exterminating replicants. After this we get another flying scene, and we actually fly up to the Tyrell building. Here you meet Lilith Tyrell, the niece of Eldon Tyrell, and this is quite reminiscent of the meeting between Rachel and Deckard, even down to the musical notes. You then follow a lead to an apartment building where Holly, your AI, talks to you about Rick Deckard. When you get there, there's a really nice ambience where you can hear people below and see all the neon lights and the spinners flying past. After some detective work, you determine that Kano Nakayama has been kidnapped, and you also find info about Night Owl, a pathogen that's deadly towards Nexus 6 models, along with a copy of your ID badge. The next scene sees you going back to the police station, where you get to perform a void comp test on a replicant, who you then tail. You then get your first shooting segment of the game, and I have to say, in VR this is extra scary. Definitely gives you vibes of Roy Batty, and I'm sure that's what they were kind of aiming for. You get the chance to spare or kill. It's hinted that you might be a replicant. You get back to the police station where Gaff and Holden interrogate you, suspecting you of being a replicant. Here's where VR is an advantage again. As you're sitting there with the two of them looking at you with the void comp test beaming into your eyes, it really does feel like you're having the screw turned on you. There's also some nice nods to the movie too.
For now, you're not a cop, you're little people.
It's now time for the final showdown with the replicant Eve. This level provides a really nice view of the city from above. It's very cyberpunk, very how you would expect it to look. Eve tells you that it's almost her 4th birthday and leads you to a room where she has Lilith Tyrell. Here you see a gruesome scene where her eyes have been gouged out in order to make a replicant of her to take over Tyrell Corp. Here Eve also tells you that you are a replicant, and if you kill her, the pathogen will be released, leading to your death, along with all of the other replicants. Here you get a choice to shoot Lilith Tyrell, Eve, or refuse, shooting Lilith to be against the replicants, shooting Eve to be with the replicants. After this you go back to the Tyrell building, where Holden is having a standoff with the replicant Lilith Tyrell. If you sided with the replicants, you will get into a standoff with Holden, and if you sided against the replicants, you will end up shooting the replicant Lilith. If you side against the replicants, you'll get an end scene with Gaff talking to you.
You're finished.
But if you side with the replicants, you end up joining the underground, and you'll receive news about a special child that needs to be smuggled out of the city, which one can only assume to be Rachel and Deckard's child.
The Resistance wants to put you on a critical assignment. There is a very special child, less than a year old. The infant must be protected and smuggled out of the city. Will you help?
I'm aware that VR is treated like a bit of a novelty. Certainly in gaming, it tends to lend itself more to drop-in action games, as opposed to long story games, and I am under no illusions that this is an incredible game. It doesn't have the best rating on IMDb, which doesn't necessarily mean anything, but I don't want you to think I'm making this kind of video where I'm talking about how underrated this game is, because technically for a VR game it's quite unremarkable. But the reason I'm so fascinated by this game is because it puts you in the streets of Blade Runner. It puts you in iconic locations seen within the film. It expands upon the story. It expands upon the lore. And I think more than anything, Blade Runner fans are just crying out for more of stuff like this. When you have such a rich and unique world, and you have people who clearly care about the franchise, who put so much into making a game like this, it's just an even bigger gut punch when you realise how few people probably even played this game. I'm not a marketing expert by any means, but I have to think that this plays a part in why nobody seems to have even heard of this game. That and the fact that in terms of the VR marketplace, Google Daydream just wasn't a big enough player to gain any traction. I know some people may say that it's just a niche VR game about Blade Runner, but if I've learned one thing, it's that Blade Runner fans seem to be obsessed with Blade Runner, along with anything to do with it. If you look at the other VR games made within this franchise during this time, they have a much bigger footprint online, and those are also the ones that are on the much more established VR brand, the Oculus Quest. But I suppose in this industry, games that appear to be the antithesis of this, with low innovation but high commercial advertising budgets, seem to be the most successful. And depressingly, projects like this that seem to be really passionate about creating something new but aren't given the resources to get eyeballs onto their product inevitably seem to sink. Now that's all speculation, but I'm hopeful to one day get a big budget Blade Runner game that really does justice to the world. But other than that, I hope this video serves to boost some kind of awareness to this game. I don't know about anyone else, but I like to read and hear and see about all of the Blade Runner lore possible. And who knows, maybe no matter how unlikely, this game will be re-released on another VR platform, remade, remastered, whatever. Or maybe we'll get new Blade Runner games. But until then, that was Blade Runner Revelations, the game lost in time.